Okay, everyone, it looks like we're right at 7 o'clock. We're going to get started. And just to let you know, we are recording this, so we will send this recording back out to everyone at the conclusion of this presentation. So thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Dana Render, and I'm the Director of Education for Trees Atlanta. And you are joining us with one of our speaker series events. And tonight we're going to be talking about building a balcony oasis with container gardening and using native plants. And so this is going to be great for those of you who are living in the city, who maybe do not have a lot of green space around you that you own, or maybe you have a balcony. And this is an opportunity for you to still be part of our ecosystem with promoting pollinators with our native plants. So if you're not familiar with Trees Atlanta, we are a nonprofit, and our mission is basically to improve and grow the canopy in Atlanta and the surrounding metro area through direct planting, conservation, and also education. And tonight, our speaker is Juliana Razverdov, and she is the Botanical Collections Manager at Wellesley College. So we want to make sure that this is a positive event for everyone. It will be interactive. We will have a Q&A session at the conclusion of Juliana's presentation. There is a Q&A button at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit questions at any point in time during the presentation. And when we get to the end, I will moderate those questions. I'll also check in the chat to see if we have any questions there. We also want to know how we can serve you better. If you have any feedback for us, you will actually get a survey from us via email. We invite you to give us some feedback. Also, it'll be an opportunity for you to let us know if there are any other topics that you'd like to hear about or learn about. And if you are looking for more information about the organization, and if you want to see more calendar events or join our newsletter, you're welcome to find us at treesatlanta.org. You can also find us on social. Additionally, Juliana is going to focus on native plants, but more specifically, the native plants that we have at our plant sale. If you didn't know, we are in the middle of our annual native plant sale, and it is being facilitated online right now. I will put that link in the chat in just a few seconds here. Additionally, you can shop with us in person next weekend at the Carter Center, where the farmers market typically is. So you'll have two opportunities. You can pre-order, and you will be able to pick up very soon, or you can get them in person. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Juliana Razverdov.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me here in my home. I am going to share my screen. Hopefully this works the first time. Okay. Oops. All right, so thanks, Dana, for that introduction. I'm excited to be talking for Trees Atlanta. I work right now at Wellesley College Botanic Gardens. I'm their Botanical Collections Manager. And before that, I got my PhD in plant sciences, doing ecosystem research on green roofs, which if you think about it, a green roof is just a really big pot. So it's sort of appropriate for this talk. But I think most pertinent to this discussion is that I am a general plant enthusiast. I love plants, I love gardening. I've been gardening my whole adult life. I love garden design, and it's really great to bring gardening to any space, and container gardening allows you to do so. So I'm sure all of you have seen this before, that there are two different kinds of plant people. People who see a slight imperfection in their plant and think that that's it, it's perished. And people that look at what appears to be a dead plant and say, I think I can save it. Now, I am in the latter category. I have saved a lot of plants. A lot of plants are sort of in the middle of this process that I have right now. What I want to tell you about with this picture is that you shouldn't be afraid. I think growing plants is very much trial and error, and especially in containers, your containered plants are gonna go through shock either initially or throughout their lives, and it's okay for plants to have imperfections. So don't worry about it, don't throw it out. The other thing that I really enjoy about this picture is that the plant on the right that looks dead implies that there's a lot more going on below ground than above ground. Your roots for the plant health are more important than the shoots. So if you see some imperfection above ground, just trust that the roots got you and they're going to make that plant strong later. So before we actually get to talking about plants, we're actually going to build up to that. So the first thing that I want everybody who's going to apply this to think about is your space. What sort of space do you have to allocate to these containers? If you have a balcony space, what kind of shading does the building provide, right? The first and most important thing is light, light, light. What direction is your balcony facing, or your patio, or wherever you're going to place your containers? Is it east? Is it to the north? The pattern of the sun is going to be different based on where you are. In the winter time, especially, or towards winter, in the fall or in the spring, you're going to have a lot more sun towards the south. So really a southern exposure, as I'm sure you all know, gets the most amount of sun. That's going to change the types of plants that you're going to be able to pot up successfully. Do you have any tree cover, or do you have building shading? Those two shades are really quite different, and on the next slide we'll look at a picture of that to show you those differences. And then wind. Do you get a lot of wind? Is it going to be windy towards the edge of your space rather than closer to the house? That's going to matter with containers because they fall over, and that could be really messy and upsetting. And there are all sorts of other considerations like leaf drop. Are your neighbors going to be annoyed with leaves getting onto their space? If you're encouraging birds to visit with, say, fruit producing plants, are people going to be annoyed that there's going to be poop on the balcony? You know, all sorts of different things that you should think about before you even get a container or think about what you're going to be putting in them. So this is the shade issue. To the right, you have a landscape that has a lot of tree shade, but you can see all of that light filtering through. Now that's called dappled shade. And you can do a lot with that because it is not consistent shade. Those plants are still getting light. The large majority of plants are shade tolerant, not shade loving, right? And on the left, you'll see what happens when a building shades a landscape. What you essentially have is a sharp line between where it's completely shaded and then bright light. So some plants are more tolerant to this and some plants are less tolerant. You're going to need something that is shade tolerant while also being able to accept bright light. Now, with a container, some people are sort of emboldened to move their plants around a lot. I want to discourage you from doing that. Don't chase the sun with your containers. The more that you move that container, the more stress that plant is under. Plants are really quite adaptable. So even though they might exhibit some stress in the beginning, the longer you leave them in that one spot, the happier they'll be over time. So these are some other considerations, right? Wind can knock over pots, especially if they're on plant stands. And then deciduous plants like the wisteria you see here are going to drop a lot of leaves, especially the bigger they get, the more leaves they're going to drop. So things to think about before you pick a plant because you think it's pretty. Okay, not we're not talking about plants just yet. We're on containers now. So I want to encourage you to think about your container as part of your media, part of the substrate, right? Because your plant is sitting in it. So it is affecting an environment on that plant. So terracotta is great. Terracotta breathes a lot, right? It's just clay. So there's an exchange of gases there that could be really beneficial to the plant. But what it does is it wicks away moisture. That means that your plant is going to get drier faster. So if you have a terracotta pot, if you have an unglazed terracotta pot, keep in mind that you may have to water it a little bit more frequently than, say, a glazed terracotta pot. Right, and these pots, these glazed pots are really beautiful, but they change the environment of the soil. If it is a glazed pot, then it is not breathing and it is retaining moisture. A dry plant is always better than a overwatered plant. You can save a wilted plant that's wilted from being too dry. You cannot save a plant that is rotted. Right? So in my experience, it's always better to have an underwatered plant than an overwatered plant. So with a glazed pot, you might prefer that if you're expecting to leave for longer periods of time, so that the plant will essentially retain that moisture for a little bit longer, but you have to regulate your water a little bit more closely because you don't want any sort of pathogens to develop in that moist environment. You might like pots that are tall and narrow. They're really deep, but they don't have a really big opening. And I think these are really beautiful. However, a lot of plants, especially a lot of our native plants, they like to spread both above ground and root-wise. You have a lot of plants that like to send out pretty shallow roots going out wide and a few deeper tap roots. So you can keep plants in these pots, but again, you have to sort of consider what they would be good for. I'm going to talk about these plants a little bit further when we get to the plant portion of the talk, but I consider tall and narrow pots to be better for grasses or things that don't really require as much maintenance. So shrubs might not be the best choice for these kinds of pots. And then you have wide and shallow pots. So you can definitely stick a couple more plants in here than you can in your more narrow pots. You might like a more landscapey palette in these wide, shallow pots, but they do take up a lot more room. So it's fun to play with kind of both. Finally, what's really important is drainage. Make sure that all of your pots have drainage holes. And furthermore, make sure that the bottoms of the pots are a little bit concave so that the drainage is not flush with whatever that pot is standing on, whether it's a plate or it's just straight on the balcony or on the ground. Now, one of the pots that's become popular is a composite. It's a manufactured material, and the large majority of those pots do not have drainage holes in them yet. You have to drill them yourself. Now, the wider that pot is, they're common as square pots, for example, I would say drill a few more holes in there, and you can do this with your standard drill bit. Okay, almost at plants. We're at their roots. So your soil or your media, it's really a soilless media that you're going to use, right? We're not going to dig up outdoors to put in the pots. It's not going to be a great environment for your containered plants. And you want something that will last through time, right? For your mix, you can definitely go ahead and get something from a big box store or a garden supply center. My one concern with most pre-mixed medias is that they have a lot of peat moss in them. And now peat moss is not a renewable resource. That comes from bogs, mostly from New Zealand, or a lot of our peat moss comes from New Zealand. And what happens is these bogs form over a long period of time, and we essentially strip them of their peat moss, and that entire environment, that entire system is gone. So I like to decrease the use of peat moss, and I do that by substituting with cocoa coir, which is just coconut husks. It's fun to imagine anyway, I think. So on the slide here, and for everyone furiously writing, you don't have to, you'll get this PowerPoint if you haven't already. So you have this information if you need it. These are just really simple medias that are mostly 3 different components that you can make on your own at home. And what cocoa coir does is a similar action to peat moss, which is allow drainage while retaining moisture, which sounds like a contradiction, but isn't. You can also get cocoa coir at a big box store like Home Depot. Viagrow is the company they use. The only issue with that cocoa coir is that it's salty. This is primarily to do with the way that the coconuts are harvested. They're essentially just thrown in the ocean and then gathered all together later, and so they accumulate a bunch of salt. You can get rid of this by washing through with tap water 4 or 5 times. So putting it in a pot, filling it up with the cocoa coir and water, and then letting it drain and pressing that water out. Doing this again several times will do the job. I prefer to get a product called Cocoa Bliss. There's a few other products available from Plantonics, and they come like bricks like this. So you can get a lot of cocoa coir in sort of a small mass, and as you moisten it up, it expands. But there are also low salt products available from specialty shops, especially hydroponic stores. This is a common media for water only, or water with nutrients only growing environments. Another common part of the media is compost. Compost is great for a myriad of reasons. It promotes aeration. It is really good at retaining water, but not creating too soggy of an environment, especially if mixed with that cocoa coir. But if you're looking for compost to provide nutrition to your plants, you should know that bagged compost mostly has no functional nutrition for the plant. That doesn't mean it doesn't provide a really nice structure to your media, and that's also really valuable, but essentially it is dead. Now you can get loose compost as well, and it should be available. I actually don't know how it's made available in different ways in Atlanta, but it is available in different places. However, loose compost also has its potential problems. It can harbor pathogens, it can harbor fly larvae, and it can harbor weed seeds if it's not properly finished. So, benefits and costs to both. And finally, an important component is sand. Now, sand really encourages that drainage. It also provides a really good structure. It's an important ingredient in your media. The most common sand you'll find in your box stores is place sand, and that's the sand you don't want to use. It's just too fine. You want to use something called mason sand, also known as builder sand, or concrete sand, also known as sharp sand. The particles are just a little bit bigger, and especially for concrete sand, it's a little bit more varied in size, which will be a good thing for your media. Okay, we're getting closer to talking about plants. How to keep your plants growing. Now, other than light, which we've already discussed a little bit, the most important, two most important things for a plant is water and food, right? That's the fertilizer. Now for water, the general rule of thumb, and you can actually use your thumb for this, is that if you stick a finger into the pot, go an inch down, and it is dry, an inch below the surface, that is when you water. On the surface of the media, it is going to dry out very quickly. So looking at it and seeing that it looks a little bit dry, that's not always a good way to estimate whether or not you need to water, right? So different plants will uptake water at different rates. So it's a really good idea to test it before you water every single time. And now as plants grow in, you're going to have to water them more and more frequently because all of those roots are taking up that water faster. So the rate at which you water will change as your plants grow bigger. You can also think about what plants prefer, right? Some plants prefer to stay more moist and some drier, but that doesn't always change your watering regime. What you should think about is how to tweak your media to suit those plants. So if a plant is more suited to a dry environment like a rocky alcove or an alpine environment, add more sand and stone to that mix. If it prefers to be in the woods, it prefers to stay a little bit wetter, and we'll talk about some of these plants, then maybe have a higher compost component to the media. And so fertilizer, if you buy a pre-bagged mix, then your fertilizer is already going to be in that mix. So you don't need to add fertilizer. Probably within the first year, you don't need to add it at all. If you make your own mix, I recommend adding a slow release, like an Osmocote fertilizer to the whole mix. Or if you've already potted up, forgot about it, went out to get it, it's cool to just mix it into the top inch of your media, or even after the plant is already planted, that's okay as well. Just make sure to mix it in a little bit. If it rests on the surface, it tends to dry out and you sort of lose that slow release capacity of it. And then you can add a bloom fertilizer once or twice over the course of the year, maybe once around June. And if you have a reblooming plant, once more in August for that fall flowering period. Rule of thumb is nitrogen is for foliage, phosphorus is for blooms. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but just in case some people aren't, on any bag or box of fertilizer, you'll have 3 numbers, and they go N, P, K. So the N, that first number, is for nitrogen concentration, the P is for phosphorus, and the K is for potassium. So if you have a higher concentration of nitrogen, that's going to be for more foliar growth. Typically, that's your average fertilizer. And then your bloom fertilizer is going to have a higher concentration of phosphorus, a little bit lower of nitrogen. Now you want to be really sparing with the fertilizer. You want to probably dilute it twice as much as the box indicates, or the instructions indicate. So really you want to keep that fertilizer to a minimum in general. And how to keep your plants alive. So now you have them growing, they're happy, and then you get to winter. Now your plants are native to your environment, the plants that we'll be talking about here. You can definitely introduce some exotic plants as well, but they just won't survive the winter outdoors. But your native plants definitely can. Again, here I want to reiterate that roots matter more than shoots. You can cut back your herbaceous perennial growth. That's anything, when I say herbaceous, I just mean anything that's not woody. So as the winter comes on, you're going to get some dieback above growth, for your above ground growth, and you can just cut that back. So your grasses, your echinacea, whatever you have growing, you can cut it back. And then bring that pot, that container, close to the house. Now, you shouldn't be moving your plants too often, but if they're kind of standing away from the building for the winter time, it's a good idea to bring it closer. The building essentially provides insulation away from wind. And just if the house leaks a little bit of heat, the plant is going to benefit from that. And you insulate the root mass, right? You don't really have to protect above ground growth, but wrap that pot in anything you have. Burlap, blankets, tarps, bubble wrap, really anything you've got. And I'll show you a picture of options on the next slide, just to insulate those root mass. You can protect above ground growth, but it's far less important, especially for the plants that we'll be talking about today. If you do protect above ground growth, you might get a little bit earlier budding in the spring than you see in the landscape. And then pruning, right? I'm not going to talk a lot about pruning because people spend their whole lives learning how to prune properly and artistically. But basically, if you want to see your shrub flower and you're considering pruning it, just prune it after it's done flowering. That way you guarantee that you get those flowers for the season. It's going to be a little bit more stressful for the plant, but they'll make it. They just might have a little bit of a more difficult season next year. If you want to rejuvenate the growth of a shrub, and this is the same for container or landscape plants, then prune in late winter, early spring. This will decrease, delay, or even eliminate the flowers that you get for that season. But you will guarantee healthier growth in the aesthetic that you intend by doing this kind of intense pruning. And of course, with rejuvenating prunings, you shouldn't do it every single year. This should be a once every few year kind of practice. And then vines, you can basically prune anytime for the large majority of them. Their habits just lean them into that kind of flexibility. So here we have some options: burlap, bubble wrap, and then leaves. If you can gather leaves in that kind of neat form, just pop a plant inside, pop a pot inside of those leaves, and that will insulate it. What I mean to say is use whatever you've got. And now for the artistic portion, I just wanted to talk really briefly about making arrangements. There are lots of considerations, but people really focus on flower color. When you think about flower color, remember that it's a little bit fleeting, or it could be fleeting. Pay attention to what season those flowers are going to be coming in, if there are sequential blooms, and if the flowers respond to deadheading, which is something we'll talk about in just a bit. But I'm really interested also in foliage structure and the foliage color, because that is going to be your longest lasting feature, and how it changes through the different seasons. I think that's really, really where you get a lot of the beauty. And you want to think about the ultimate heights of those plants, how they're going to pair together. So you want something tall in the back, something shorter in the front. But you can also use landscaping principles like blocking and massing. So if you have a large amount of one type of plant together, say your coreopsis, that's going to look really incredible even when it's just in a container. It's really going to get that focus to that plant if it's in a mass. And finally, the rule of three, or rather the rule of not 2 and 4. When you're arranging your containers, it's a really good idea to have just 1 in a space or 3 paired next to each other, because if you have 2 or an even number, your eye tends to split the difference and look between the containers rather than what's in them. So it's a lot more aesthetically pleasing. If you have 3, you'll notice this in magazines. It's almost always sets of 3, which I found really fun. And I just put this color wheel up here to talk a little bit about analogous colors and complementary colors. I prefer, as I was going through and picking arrangements I like to show, I noticed I was picking a lot more analogous colors, but complementary colors are great for kind of in-your-face, joyous, and I'll show you some of those too. So let's get into plants. Yay! So here you see some analogous colors that I really like. That bright red, deep red of that grass that's contrasting in structure to the lantana just below it that's creeping out. So you're seeing the complement of heights. The colors go well together. So it's a good container, and it's there on its own, so it follows the rule of 3. And this one also follows the rule of 3. You have an annual adorning the perennials in this container set. In the front, you have that sweet alyssum. Now, annuals, you're not going, I don't think it's really a good idea to try to keep them over winter. You're kind of likely to introduce pests. They're not going to look very good the second year around. So if you include an annual, it's great. Just anticipate replacing it over time. And here's a mass, right? And it's surrounded by 2 shrubs. And all of these containers, all 3, is just one species in the pot. I really like a shrub on its own in a container, as I said earlier, and this is why they take up nice space, they have a nice form, and your eye can sort of focus on them. And here's a nice example of a wide and shallow pot. I'll spend a little bit more time on this one because these are native plants. So this wide, shallow pot is a good example of bringing the landscape into a container. It's a little bit messy, but they have, all these plants have sequential blooms, so you're gonna have a lot of visual interest all the time. They bring in a lot of really great pollinators, so they'll be buzzing, like imagine them buzzing with bumblebees. So you have your echinacea, that's your pink plant in that picture. You have some coreopsis, which is one of the yellow daisy-like flowers, and you have some sunflowers there in the background as well, Helianthus. And in the front, you have one of my favorite plants. It's a pycnanthemum. It's a mountain mint, and I love the white flowers on them, but also that silvery foliage. It's also delicious. It's a good alternative to your more traditional mint. And I wanted to show you this picture because here they're using the size of the containers to really play with the plants that you focus on. Now, the stoichesia that's in the front there, that purple flowering aster-like plant, is quite short, but by planting it in a taller container, you really bring it up to your eye and you're going to pay attention to that plant. So I really like the way that containers can play with perspective as well. And again, we have analogous colors here, which I am favorable towards. So I decided to put in a picture with complementing colors, and you can see that they're really joyous. And this is a good way to exhibit a lot of annuals, your pansies, has some of the nasturtiums, that bright orange. It's really fun to play with those colors. All right, so I'm really excited because I'm actually on time. Yay! So we'll start getting into some of the plants that are available for purchase in the Trees Atlanta plant sale. I've created a sort of a spreadsheet that will be sent out to you, detailing different shrubs that I've different plants really that I've picked that I think are good for container growing or are particularly conducive to it. But I won't be talking about every single one of them. I just picked a few to focus on here. Again, I think it's really nice to leave a shrub as a single plant in a container, or you can underplant it with something that won't be too competitive, so the roots won't go down too deep. That's something short, something sprawling, or even something cascading off the side of the pot, which I really like the look of. Typically annual, those are more annual plants. All right, so the plant on the right there with the red flowers is Malviscus arboreus. I love this plant, and I'm in Massachusetts, so I can't grow this outside. You guys can, so you should take advantage of it because it's such an awesome plant. It takes really well to pruning. It has sequential blooms, so it'll bloom continuously. I just think it's a really beautiful close relative of hibiscus, so it has that same kind of flower structure. And this is the flower as it's fully open. The petals never open beyond this, so it's also just has that interest to it. And on the left you see hydrangea. Now this is actually a hydrangea macrophylla, but you have arborescens available to you, which just has a similar look. That's the smooth leaf hydrangea. And I just think hydrangeas take really well to being containerized. They look great. They respond well to deadheading, that is cutting off spent blooms, and they will rebloom. Now, hydrangeas prefer a more acidic media, and you can amend that with an acidifying fertilizer that you'll find at big box stores or your garden center. You can also acidify with sulfur compounds. So just adding a little bit goes a long way with sulfur, just so you know. And other plants that are on your list are like rhododendrons. That's your azaleas and rhododendrons. They prefer more acidic environments as well, and they would be do well containerized. Whenever you're thinking about taking a shrub and putting it in a container, you can typically arrest the growth of that plant by pruning. And what you're doing essentially is creating a bonsai. So obviously we know that we can take a giant tree and keep it in a tiny pot for many, many years. We just have to pay more attention to keeping it alive, having a good watering schedule, fertility, all of that. And actually there's a bonsai right So it's the same with shrubs. You can keep them more compact with pruning and maintenance like that. So they'll make really good container plants. And I just wanted to put this in here. It's Viburnum nudum. I love this plant. It attracts so many pollinators. It'll just be buzzing throughout the summer. And then as you approach its fruiting season over into fall, it gets these gorgeous red color, reddish purple color to its leaves, and produces bright blue berries that the birds love. So you get your pollinators, you get your birds. It's just great. I love this plant. I have one in my backyard, a different viburnum. All right, moving on to perennials. Now, this is a poor choice of words, of course, because all the plants we're talking about right now are perennial, but by this I mean herbaceous perennials. Now, you're probably going to spend the most time picking through your herbaceous perennials. They're fun to play with. I would say, again, pair your tall upright perennials with lower creeping plants. Masses, they create masses in color. It's okay to just have one species, just a few plugs in a container will fill out and look gorgeous. You might need to put a bit of maintenance when you containerize these perennials. They'll go through some stress. So removing those yellow leaves or cutting it back down so that it stays shorter, and deadheading, again, removing those spent flowers to encourage new flowers to come up. And plants are competitive, right? What you see above ground does not always exactly betray what's happening underneath. So some plants are just more competitive, some plants are less. And we'll go through a few of these examples. But it's always a good idea to pair your more competitive plants with other plants that are competitive so that over time, one doesn't win against the other. Of course, if you have a competitive plant, you might have to water it more frequently. The roots are just going to take over the entire entirety of the resources a little bit faster. And you want to pair your less competitive plants with other less competitive plants. So here I've got Eupatorium dubium. This is actually, that's the purple flowering plant you see there. This is the Baby Joe variety that you can purchase from Trees Atlanta. If you get the wild type, it just grows to up to 4 or 5 feet. So you might want to just keep it shorter. You have another Eupatorium solecinum in the middle there. And you have the orange butterfly weed, one of my favorite plants of all time, Asclepias tuberosa on the left there. Now, Eupatorium, the Eupatoriums are really competitive below ground. They're going to keep on sprouting from their root mass. So it's good to pair them together. And the Asclepias is competitive in its own right, but it also has a long taproot. So it's going to go down where the Eupatoriums may not colonize as quickly. So just thinking about that a little bit will really improve the longevity of your container plantings. I also love the Eupatorium dubium because it has that deep red stem. So even without the blooms, it has a lot of visual interest. Asclepias tuberosa also responds really, really well to deadheading. And you can cut it shorter. It'll just bloom more. It'll branch out more. So you'll have more blooms and it'll be a shorter plant. This is another nice combination with less competitive plants. You have your Liatris spicata, that's the tall purple plant there, Blazing Star. You have a few different options that Plants Atlanta has for you. They come in different colors. They might vary in height a little bit. And then you have the blue-eyed grass or Scissorhynchium angustifolia. And in real life, this picture looks really blue. In real life, they go from white to purple by my eyes. But they're really nice combination. The Liatris is really tall. The blue-eyed grass is a little bit shorter, is pretty short actually. But also that foliage, again, it plays together well, I think. So it's always a good idea to think about the bloom as well as the foliage. And that Liatris is super amazing at attracting butterflies. So always fun to have butterflies visiting your balcony, I think. And so here we have a little bit more shady, woodsy plants. So this again features one of my favorite plants of all time. That's the Silene regia, that red plant you see on the screen. In this picture, it does not show you how red these plants are. You will see these plants from across the street when they're blooming. They are just the brightest red. And I love them. They're great pollinator plants. They can tolerate deep shade, bright light. They are just winners in my book. And I paired that with Tiarella. That's the plant in the middle. It's foam flower. I really like that contrast of the white and red. And the leaves, when they're exposed to more sun, actually get this really deep red venation on them, which is really beautiful. Again, you get the Silene that's more tall, upright, and the Tiarella that stays shorter. And I added a fern in there. That's the Dryopteris marginalis, a marginal wood fern, and you can pick really any fern. Just think about the ultimate size that it gets. This is the only time I'm going to talk about ferns here. Ferns are great. I think they're a great plant, especially the taller ones, to be on its own in a container. And they can be very resilient, but just if you've never grown ferns before, you might have a little bit of hit and miss with that at first. And I wanted to give another option if you wanted to keep it all red. I also love this plant. It's very unusual, and I think it's on the picture for this talk. So I figured I should include it. It's a Spigelia marilandica. It's gorgeous, doesn't respond as well to deadheading in my experience, but when it flowers, it has this very unusual shape, and the shape of the leaves is also very unusual. So it has a lot of good interest. And then we have a little bit of a drier plant grouping. So these plants like it a little bit more rocky, maybe don't mind drying out as much. So again, if you leave for longer periods of time, it might be a good idea to have plants that don't mind drying out. And your irises, your rhizomatous irises, are particularly good at that. There are irises that are habituated to wetlands, so just pay attention to what you're getting. In this case, it's an Iris cristata, which is habituated to rocky slopes. And on the left, you have a Stachysia laevis. We already saw this plant. And then you have the Manfreda virginica, which is commonly known as a false aloe. I just think that shape is really interesting. It doesn't really look like a plant native to our environment, but it is. So I really like it. These plants together sit at about the same height, which is also kind of nice. It creates a little bit of a landscape. Now, grasses. I really like grasses in container that are single specimens because they like to flow out, and they have these really gorgeous blooms, many of them. So I'm going to feature just two grasses that are options for you guys off of the plant list. That's these two. On the right, you have a North Sea oats, Chasmanthium latifolium. I love this grass. It is very habituated to a shady environment, but it can also be in some direct light. When those blooms dry out, they sound like rattles in the wind, which is just beautiful. So, you know, not just a visual aesthetic, but an audio aesthetic as well. And then on the left, that purple blooming grass is Muhlenbergia capillaris, and it's just a stunner. It really is. And it looks great when it's blooming, but it also looks lovely when it's not. So it has both of those things going for it. As you see, it really likes to fall wide when it has the opportunity. So it might be nice to feature it as its own specimen, like you see in this picture. All right, vines. So I touched on vines a little bit earlier. Pruning them is really not a big deal. You can prune them anytime you like. Their habit is just responsive to that. Of course, if you have a part of a vine that's a little bit more woody, like wisterias get woody over time, then you pruning back the woody bits aren't as resilient as pruning back something that's more herbaceous. Whenever you have a vine, before you plant it, think about the trellising, think about where it's going, not where it's starting, because vines can look messy pretty quickly. But they can also be a lot of fun. Like this fun combination of a coreopsis, that's Coreopsis integrifolia on the left there. And honestly, again, one of my favorite vines. It's called the Carolina Jasmine, smells fantastic. Gelsemium sempervirens. And you can see how the vine can get pretty messy pretty quickly. So it's important to keep it pruned, especially if you're in a limited space, and let it grow up something. But I really love this bright yellow in your face. And I'm going to touch really briefly on wisteria. Wisteria frutescens is the American wisteria, so it's not the Chinese or the Japanese variety that you're going to see more commonly. It grows a little bit more slowly. The flowers are a little bit smaller, but trust me, this plant is just as fantastic. It smells amazing. And if you start pruning it pretty early on, you can create a shrub of it. So it can either grow as a vine or you can make it into a shrub. So I kind of tried to show pictures of both here. And the one thing to know about wisteria is that as it grows really tall, you can't forget that the roots need spaces too. So if you're going to let your vine really take over the top of your balcony or patio or whatever you have, really give it a nice big pot to begin with so that it can grow over time, develop that thick woody stem, and delight you for years to come. And then I wanted to touch a little bit more on indoor or outdoor plants. You really don't want to bring any of these perennials indoors because it will mess with their dormancy cycles. That means they're just never going to be as healthy. But you can bring sensitive plants indoors. I'm thinking if you want to do herbs, your basils, your parsley, Spanish lavender, things like that, you can bring those indoors, and you can bring them in when temperatures start consistently dropping below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Move your plants to a shady location first for up to a week. So if they were in bright light, they have a chance to adjust because your house is always going to be darker than the outdoors, no matter what, really. And then maybe move them next to a door or window that you can keep open during the day when they're inside, again, just to ease that transition. And then watch out for pests. Quarantine, quarantine, quarantine. Bringing the outdoors indoors essentially means that all those pests that were going to die outdoors in the wintertime are going to find happy hosts indoors, right? So you may worry about infecting your indoor plants with your outdoor plants. So just consider that. And finally, I just wanted to touch on a few edibles that you can grow. Gonna run through them pretty quickly. I know we're running out of time. So first, I think herbs are gorgeous. This is a whole planter made out of herbs. You've got some basil, you've got some sweetgrass in the background there, or maybe that's a lemongrass, not sure. All sorts of things. You can use only perennial herbs that you'll be fine leaving out over the winter time, like your thyme, sage, that kind of thing. I believe even rosemary in your zone you might be able to keep outside over winter, or that might be one of those plants that you bring back indoors. But I think herbs are beautiful and they're functional. And so are vegetables. This is kale, happens to be my favorite kale to eat. It's Dido kale or glacinato. And other kales are also beautiful. Russian kale with that red central vein, I think is gorgeous. Okra, I mean, how beautiful is that? That is a gorgeous bloom. And this is a red variety, a red cultivar. Those beautiful red stems. I just think this is glorious, and you can grow it on your patio. It does get fairly big, just a warning. And hot peppers. Hot peppers love a little bit of torture. The more torture, the hotter they get. So bringing them near death and bringing them back, those are going to be the hottest hot peppers. And you can bring them in during the winter, keep them under lights to keep that sun on them. And then next year, they'll probably develop that woody stem too. So they'll be like your hot pepper tree. And finally, on your list, you have a few rubus. There's rubus. These are raspberries or black raspberries. And if you containerize them, just make sure they're the dwarf variety. Read up on how quickly they'll produce fruit for you, because you might not get fruit that first year. But how wonderful is it to have this beautiful plant that you can also eat the berries of? I think that's great. You might also want a thornless variety, because in a limited space, you don't want to be constantly pricking yourself. But how wonderful it is to have something beautiful that you can also consume. And that's it for me. I went a little bit over my time, but I look forward to your questions, and I hope that you got something out of this.
Yes, definitely. We actually have a lot of great questions, but this was really great information for us. I definitely learned a lot. So I'm going to jump right into the questions. And everyone, because we are at 7:57, we'll still answer these questions, but if you have to jump off for any reason, you are welcome to do so. We'll still be recording the answers to these questions, and you'll get this recording later. So feel free to stay as long or not as long as you like, but we'll go on for another 10 or 15 minutes just answering the questions that have come in. So with that said, the first question, do you have a local source for potting media that you recommend?
So I am not local to Atlanta, so I am not the best resource for this, but I'm sure you have garden centers around. Maybe, I don't know, Dana, do you have any recommendations?
Well, there's Pike Nurseries. There's also Home Depot and Lowe's if they have those available. So that they're pretty prolific around here. And there's probably a few smaller independent little nursery areas, but the big box stores we definitely have here.
Yeah, again, I would always encourage you to kind of make your own media, paint your own picture.
So what are the best plants for beginners? Like what the common names of those plants, and especially the ones that you mentioned today, are there any that are really good for beginner growers?
I mean, I would say really anything I mentioned would be okay. Maybe for really early on, you might want to stay away from shrubs because they tend to be a little bit touchier. With really a good rule of thumb is you're much more likely to keep a plant alive if you get it a little bit younger at the beginning, because they will just adapt to whatever conditions you have. So the grasses, that Muhlenbergia, you basically can't kill. That's probably a good one. so that's the, I actually don't know the common name for that plant. I'm sorry.
Are you talking about the mully grass? The
Yeah,
pink, the
probably.
cotton candy mully grass?
Yes, yes. Thank you. And the Stokes aster, the Stokesia is really easy. The echinaceas are really easy to keep alive as well. I didn't mention those, but those are great. Coreopsis is also really great. I believe that's also the common name for that. So all of those are really easy plants.
Awesome. And in the chat, someone mentioned Garden Hood is a great place to find some of those media if you're still interested, and there is a link there. All right. So the next question, are there any possibilities to use like grow bags for watering?
Totally. Yeah. Grow bags are great. Definitely a lot more air exchange. It's actually a lot healthier for the roots. I didn't really focus on them because that's not what I think of as container growing necessarily. And typically they're used more for edible food crops. And they just, I've had experience with them ripping after a couple of uses. So that's just because they're made that way to be able to breathe. And then the water is just, you're going to have to water the whole container instead of focusing on the center of the plant because you have a more even water distribution. It's not a bad thing, but definitely you can basically grow anything and anything if you pay attention enough.
And speaking of watering, a lot of those containers, they may have the drip pans or the drain pans. Is it better to water on top of the plant or put water in the drain pan so it can go up through the bottom?
With so the capillary action of your media is going to be important here. One thing I didn't mention is putting rocks at the bottom of your pot. Don't do that. I'm not sure who started this fad, but just don't put rocks at the bottom of your pot. You're raising the water table. You're not doing what you want to do. So definitely bottom watering is great, but it depends on that capillary action. If it's a really long way to go up, right, some of those bigger containers, it's going to be harder for the media to do this. It's also going to be easier if you have a unglazed terracotta pot because the whole pot will act to raise that water up. So definitely bottom watering is a great thing, and you're just not going to overwater if you only do bottom watering.
So if you can't drill a hole in the container that you have, what do you suggest?
Don't use the container. Honestly, I mean, you can be very careful about how you water. Sure, that'll work for some people. But I mean, I know plants fairly well, and I don't remember how often I water. And I think I've killed every single plant I've had in a container that doesn't have drainage. So just don't.
I understand that. So let's talk about some pollinators. If you're living about 5 to 10 stories up, how will that affect pollinators visiting your oasis that you're building?
Yeah, so what you're going to get, it's going to be fewer, most likely. And what you're going to get is passers-by. So if you have plants year after year, you'll notice that you're going to get way more pollinators the second year and then the third year than you got that first year because they just haven't found you. They haven't built that pathway to you yet. And you're going to get things that probably travel more. So a lot of our solitary bees are ground nesters that don't go too far from where they're nesting. So you might not get some of the solitary bees, but you'll get maybe some of the carpenter bees or mason bees rather. You'll get butterflies for sure if they're migrating past. So, but eventually you'll get all sorts of things.
So what plants will support the most caterpillars from this list that you talked about tonight?
Oh, I mean, butterfly weed. I think I think Liatris is also a larval host, but really any of the Asclepias, any of the, oh, I'm blanking on the common name. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the common name. Any of the Asclepias species, so your butterfly weed is among them, are larval hosts for a slew of different butterflies, and you'll see them on them, and they're also food host for them. So it's great. It's a food host for the caterpillars, food host for the mature butterflies as well, depending on which butterfly. A lot of butterflies don't have mouth parts.
So you're talking about like the milkweed, like the
Thank
swamp
you.
milkweed.
Milkweed. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. And what about using Miracle Grow? Is that a risk for pollinators, like using that commercial fertilizer or even the potting mix that they make?
It's not a no, it's not a risk for pollinators. The only risk for pollinators you have, and it's really not that great, is your systemic pesticides. And it's only if you apply your systemic pesticides while the plant is in bloom. The large majority of the systemics will not go past a previously existing barrier within the plant, so it won't go into new growth. But the downside to the fertilizers that I didn't mention, I just said use them sparingly, is really that they make an overall weaker constitutional plant. So if you think about pests, they have to break through that cell wall, and more fertilizer means that the plant is growing faster and not necessarily having those building blocks. Kind of like having a fatty diet with a lot of calories, but your body can't really use those. So you just kind of grow, but you're not using them. It's the same kind of thing. Like it's like eating a lot of sugar. So it must alter the flower in some way. I've never done a study or read a study about that, but it's not going to be overall harmful for the pollinators.
What about compost tea or worm casting tea? Is that good for container edibles?
Oh, yeah, of course. It's good for anything.
Awesome. What about some herb suggestions?
Herb suggestions for containers.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm leaning towards anything you can think of. Really, your parsley, cilantro, those things you just want to bring indoors over winter. If you want to keep things outdoors, sage, marjoram, thyme, anything like that will do great. I love rosemary. I'm really bad at growing rosemary because it just gets every pest imaginable. So keeping that as an annual and maybe taking cuttings or something to keep over winter is a great idea. Can you keep rosemary outside over winter in Atlanta?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the stores will sell the big rosemary shrubs as little tiny Christmas trees. So, yes.
I'm not sure. Somebody has to check on that. Maybe you can.
Yeah. Okay. Can you mix herbs like rosemary in a pot with other plants that are not edible?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Live your life. Do what you want. I think honestly, like rosemary has a really lovely smell. Mixing that with something like echinacea, that will bloom over top of it is gorgeous. Plus, you can use the echinacea root. It's a really good it's really good for several different intestinal issues. So use your echinacea roots.
Now, you also mentioned wisteria. Is that considered not native because of its origins in the US, or?
So the wisteria that I recommended that Trees Atlanta does sell is Wisteria frutescens, which is the American wisteria. I am, the Japanese and the Chinese wisterias that you're going to see more commonly in the landscapes do escape into the wild, so I'm not a huge fan of them. They're also very, very aggressive, so they grow quickly and they overtake spaces. So I've seen several trees. It looks pretty, but the vine is just overtaking the tree and it's killing the tree. So American wisteria essentially won't do that.
I have one last question, and it's about bugs like mosquitoes and other pests that really like plants. What kinds of things can you grow on a balcony or in a container that will repel mosquitoes, or because we have a lot of those down here?
Well, you can definitely plant your citronella. I've used citronella before. I can't say it was a super great repellent on its own. Um, by the way, there's like a couple of different, this is why I hate common names, because a few different plants are named mosquito plants, but what you want if you're thinking of that smell, the repellent is citronella plants. So yeah, just differentiate between those two. They kind of have a similar leaf structure. Maybe that's why they were both called mosquito plant. But not having any standing water is going to be your best bet for not having mosquitoes near you. If you're by a bog or somewhere else you can't control standing water, I don't know, mosquito netting, I guess.
Could you grow something like lavender or some of like onion plants like alums or
Uh, I don't know how good they are about repelling mosquitoes, to be honest. I mean, they smell great, but yeah, I'm not sure that. So alliums are and marigolds and stuff like that. They're really good at repelling plant pests, but I don't know how good they are at repelling human pests, because the mosquito is not after plants, right? It's after you, so it's not going to work as well.
All right, I think actually that was all of our questions. I'll do one last call. If anyone has anything else, you can put it quickly in the chat. But just to remind everyone, we will send the recording. We'll also send the slides, and we'll put in the pictures of those plants with the common names so that you can find them with our plant sale list, which is still live now. And you can still buy some plants. We still have a little bit left, and then we have the in-person sale coming up in another week or so. But, oh, wait, it says Trees Atlanta, do you have other info sessions about plants that will be available during the sale or recordings of previous ones? This is the actual only plant sale program that we're doing right now. However, we do have a tree sale in the fall, which will be in October. And we typically do a program called Right Tree, Right Place, where we talk about different trees that we're selling and also where to plant them in your yard if you have the space. We also sell shrubs there too. So if you're looking for containerized shrubs, we do have some that would be available during the tree sale, and we'll do a talk before then. But we won't have any more regarding the plant sale right now or any other series about that. However, we do a lot of different types of classes and learning opportunities. For example, we talk a lot about the Beltline and what's blooming there. We have some recordings about basic botany. So if you're interested in those types of things, let me know. Send me an email at dana@treesatlanta.org because we have a lot of those recordings already. And we'd be happy to send them to you or direct you to where they are on our YouTube page. Alrighty. Oh wait, there's one more. Someone snuck in for baskets, for hanging baskets and planters. How much should you water those?
I'm gonna say those words again. It depends. It depends how much, what kind of basket it is. So if the air passes through it, obviously it's hanging, so more wind is going to be passing by it. So it's going to dry out more rapidly. You're also in a lot less danger of overwatering because that is going to drain a lot faster and a lot more freely. So it depends on the plant and its needs. But again, I would just say touch that media, get your finger down there and test if it's drying out 1 inch below the surface.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. It looks like we've answered all the questions. We really appreciate you joining in with us tonight. Thank you also, Juliana, for all of your wealth of knowledge. We really appreciate you bringing that to us with some awesome tips. We hope that you guys have a good rest of the evening and feel free to join us for other opportunities that we have for learning. Thanks again and have a great night.
Thank you so much.